Hello, hello.
Okay, let's go.
Yeah, welcome everyone to this session where we're going to discuss about case studies for unlocking carbon revenue through tech development to boost wildlife economies and restore ecosystems. So my name is Peter Makumbe. I'm the research manager at Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation based at Shangani Holistic in Zimbabwe. To my left, immediate left, is Duncan McFadden. He's the head of research and conservation at the Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation based in South Africa. Next is Max Makovise. Max Makovise is the resident director at Shangani Holistic in Zimbabwe. And then last but not least is Matthew Child, is the project manager at the South African National Biodiversity Institute. So today we're going to talk about how we can unlock, carbon markets in Africa. So first up, I will ask Duncan to introduce the role of the Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation, in the climate space. Duncan, over to you.
Great, thanks, Peter. I don't know many of you are familiar with Oppenheimer Generations, but it's made up of a number of entities which support the Oppenheimer family's interest. Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation is one of those entities, and the focus is very much on, and Jonathan Oppenheimer always talks about the simultaneous equation of man on the one side and environment on the other, and understanding the interplay around the social, we hear a lot about that, economic, and of course environmental aspects. Climate change is obviously very close to our hearts. I mean, we see the real risk. I think anyone here today can feel the heat. It is a real threat, and through our support, we look at partnering with key individuals and organizations across Africa that will be able to help mitigate these impacts, understand, put solid science at the base of what decisions are made. And through that, we've partnered with quite a number of big programs and experts, one being the African Wildlife Economy Institute, Rewild Capital, and Matt, one of the founders, is here today, Opals, Oppenheimer Program in African Landscape Systems, Future Ecosystems for Africa, Odie and Lara are here, and a number of other big programs which we could talk about a little later. But these programs are all looking at helping us understand, specifically across the continent of Africa, what are the real risks and how do we mitigate those risks. The Oppenheimer family also has large land holdings, and through rewilding, Shangani Ranch, and the resident director is here, Swalu Kalahari Reserve in the Northern Cape, and of course, we all know that the drier, hotter areas are going to feel it the most, certainly from a heat perspective, and certain animals are on the edge of their physiological means of adapting to climate change, and the increase in temperatures will push certain species to extinction. We also obviously very interested in preventing biodiversity loss, and have a number of big programs looking at impacts of climate change on species and species range. That's all for me for now. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Duncan. Next up, I'll ask Max Makovise to talk about his work at Shangani Holistic and their management model. Over to you, Max.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm going to read off a sheet, otherwise I'll talk beyond the 5 minutes you've allotted me. There's often talk about cattle and methane, about wildlife and land, but the majority of the time this is used in isolation. And methane is a very big topic that's coming up, and it's part of the attempt to try and say we should eat less beef, there should be less cattle. An interesting fact is recent figures that have just come out. 50% of the world's cattle are in Brazil and India. And in the 2018 FAO stat figures, 20% of the global cattle population was in Africa. So you've got 70% of the world's global cattle population in India, Brazil, and Africa. And what part do we play in influencing what should be going on with cattle? Zero. It's all coming from elsewhere. So what we're trying to do is do a lot of the work, having research helping us. We get the science side of things. I do the talking side as well as the cattle side of things, and we're trying to find our way through. At Shangali Holistic, in collaboration with OGRC, Duncan over here, we're looking at ways to improve ecosystems in a manner that seeks to first do no harm. Again, I'm going to be controversial. There's a lot of talk about, when people talk rewilding, they talk about reforestation. Why do we want to plant trees on the African savanna where we never had trees in the first place? We should be looking at solutions that are not only good for the climate of where we live, but also things that have been there forever. So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel, we're simply going to polish it. On our ranch, just a few things about our ranch. We're 65,000 hectares, two pieces, one 45,000, one 20,000. They are not contiguous. We have no internal fences on the ranch and have wildlife, cattle, and humans living in harmony. It's very interesting. It's part of the work the guys at research do involves coloring animals, and I know for a fact that about 600 meters from my house I have a resident leopard. It doesn't interfere with me, I don't interfere with it. It's not eating our cattle. There's lots of impalas that she seems to be, Nancy, seems to be feasting on. And we're trying to understand how the human-wildlife cattle interaction takes place and how we can take what we learn and move it out into the vast areas, especially the rural areas. When we have an elephant migration from the national park to the ranch every year, and it's 300 to 400 male elephants, only male elephants. Now, there are many theories as to why that happens, but they come onto the ranch and we drive past them, they walk past us. We don't interfere with each other. And what we try and do is understand how they act and how they work so that we can also educate the surrounding farmers and surrounding villages. We, at the ranch, practice holistic management with our cattle. Now, holistic management is quite a interesting topic. Some people see it one way, some people don't like it, some people do like it. I think we just look at what is a holistic method of managing our land that suits us in our environment. It's not about taking a textbook and following that. It's about what suits us, taking the information we've learned and sharing it with the communities around us. Matt will talk a bit later about Rewild and their work, but he's been instrumental in allowing us to measure exactly what it is that we do. The Zimbabwean government itself has taken a keen interest in what we're doing, and we're hoping to do our bit. We've just had a new carbon credit law passed in the country, and we intend to share whatever knowledge we've gained. Having a research department also helps us be quite different from most other cattle ranchers in that we can monitor our vegetation. What are the cattle doing to the grass? What are the wildlife doing to the grass? Is bush encroachment an issue? Coloring animals, we color leopards, elephants, and more recently, Peter's collared some vultures, which have traveled some great distances since they were colored last week. And one of the greatest advantages I have on the ranch is the ability to study on a scientific basis for concerns that we might have, be it fire or poaching. So that's basically in a nutshell what we're about.
Thank you for that great introduction, Max. Now I hand over to Matthew. Matthew is going to talk about issue of carbon credits in Africa and rewilding, how we can use rewilding to unlock carbon markets in Africa.
Thanks so much, Peter, and thanks everyone for being here. And I hope that what we can get out of this panel is a discussion on triple bottom line solutions using the voluntary carbon markets, which I think exist, but also importantly, Africa-led solutions, which are currently not really reflected in the voluntary carbon market. So, but I really think there is a lot of potential for us to use the resources that we have, our wildlife, our biodiversity, our indigenous knowledge, to ramp up high integrity carbon credits in Africa. So just to zoom out a little bit on the sort of policy space, we're currently in the UN Decade of Restoration. The Global Biodiversity Framework has been ratified. So there is a lot of policy support to do the restoration work, to restore our ecosystems, to restore biodiversity, and to make this, to get these into working landscapes that allow people to make livings. However, the costs of doing this restoration are exorbitant. So the carbon credits can be used to help landowners and communities overcome the opportunity cost of doing sustainable land management. But unfortunately, what we have in Africa at the moment is that most of the credits that have been issued, I'd say like 99%, are from avoided emissions projects, which Max alluded to, is basically forest conservation, above ground biomass. And while that is applicable in some areas, in about 50% of the continent, which we consider rangelands, which are grasslands or savannas, planting trees can undermine biodiversity. It can reduce the capacity of that system to promote inclusive livelihoods. And it can also promote or incentivize protecting bush encroachments, which, as we know, is a major degradation problem in our rangelands. So what is the solution? Well, we've got to radically ramp up the other asset class of carbon credits, which is soil carbon credits, because soil carbon credits are removals projects, first of all, so they sequester additional carbon from the atmosphere. They are compatible with grazing systems based on herbivore production, because it's about adjusting grazing management, fire management, etc. And they are long-term carbon stores in savannas that also experience fires and should experience fires for ecosystem functioning. So of course, when a fire comes through and takes out your above ground stocks, if you've managed that rangeland successfully, the sequestered carbon is safe in the soil. So really this can be a solution. And in particular, Africa has a superpower in that we have huge amounts of biodiversity, huge amounts of rangelands and ecosystems, and huge amounts of wildlife. Now, the science shows us that when we rewild these rangelands, soil carbon stocks increase compared to just livestock-only systems. So this is what we call restoring trophic diversity to a system, in that the ecological functions of our wildlife can help to process nutrients and store additional carbon in the soils. Now, rewilding also means not just adding animals or adding wildlife to a system, it also means restoring ecological processes. So in Africa, this is normally driven by the combination between grazing and fire. And again, the science is very clear that when you move from a continuous grazing system to some form of rotational grazing system that mimics the natural grazing patterns that we used to have and allows the grass layer to recover, that can also radically increase soil carbon sequestration. And the last point I want to make on that is that these two, trophic complexity and natural disturbances, as they're called, are not mutually exclusive. You don't have to separate out cattle and wildlife. Those two herbivore classes can exist on the same piece of land and have even higher rates of soil carbon sequestration. Shongani is a case in point, which we'll talk to now. So really, this is one of Africa's, should be one of Africa's solutions to sustainable development and the use of soil carbon markets, where you use some form of rotational grazing for your cattle to mimic stochastic grazing patterns, and you allow wildlife to move across the landscape to perform their ecological functions to sequester carbon. And then what that ends up doing is also stimulating long-term enterprises that are sustainable, such as regenerative agriculture or wildlife-based economies based on ecotourism or sustainable hunting. I'm almost finished. And by that is why what we like to say is rewilded rangeland credits should be a premium credit class to be sold on the international markets. And we need to do the work to market that to the global north, to show them that we can have a triple bottom line solution, carbon mitigation, biodiversity conservation, and sustainable livelihoods beyond the carbon project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for that. I'll just ask some questions here, and then the gentleman will answer the questions, then we can ask from the floor as well later. Okay, my first question is to Duncan. I think you you shared much about the work of the Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation. Would you, maybe at this point in time, explain how the OGRC is contributing to combating climate change?
Sure, Peter. Again, like programs like Rewild, FIFA, we look at big programs, as I said, that will move the dial. They must be large on the African continent, and they mustn't be narrow in scope. They really need to be over a broad area and have tangible outcomes. As mentioned, solid science behind this is so important, and we really need to develop opportunities across the continent to really make that difference. We'll talk about Rewild a little later, but on the properties Swalu, as mentioned, the Kalahari, that is largely made up of old cattle farms. And what we're doing is in the process of rewilding those cattle farms, incorporating them into larger conservation areas. Shangani Ranch, and again, Max will tell you a bit more. I mean, that had 30,000 cattle on it in paddocks. All those paddocks were dismantled, and cattle and wildlife now live together. And putting each of these properties have research centers on them. So we facilitate our own research, we support, we don't like to say we fund, we like to be further, more of a partner than a funder. And Laura and Odie are here. One of the really exciting initiatives that FIFA developed last year was 2 technical reports on an African position on climate change for land and oceans, and that involved quite a number of I think 40 or so countries from around from across Africa, and I think those reports are really showing what Africa needs, and we so often are influenced by the global north, which in some ways, in some cases is good, but I think we need, and someone said, African voices and, African solutions to African problems. So, we want to also develop the next generation of climate scientists. A lot of focus goes into capacity and developing people from across Africa in this space.
That's great. Maybe I will ask Matthew to expand on his work at the Tswalu Kalahari Reserve and also at Shangani Holistic. What have been your experiences in terms of unlocking carbon credits for Africa from these 2 case studies?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I think the first thing to say about those projects, I think in one of the panels earlier today, they were talking about context-specific solutions to the problems, and that is really what we need to emphasize, in that each system, the right thing to do from an ecological or from a regenerative point of view is going to be different. So, for example, and this is where the rewilding paradigm can really help us, in Tswalu Kalahari, which is a fence reserve, in drought conditions, those animals are not able to move out of the system easily. And so what you have is almost like a sort of continuous grazing system in a sense. So what management recognized was that the right thing to do there was to drop the stocking rate of wildlife and try and simulate a more stochastic grazing system to alleviate the pressure on the grassy layer. So at Rewild, we were able to model what that would do for the soil carbon, and that was the project there. And I think that is a particularly good model for increasingly fenced, protected areas across Africa that are going to be suffering from potential issues of overstocking or are looking to earn carbon revenue, but they need to do something different. So that might be one potential solution to help restore the ecosystem while at the same time earning carbon revenue. In Shangani, it was a complete opposite situation, in that there is enough rainfall to support high stocking rates of cattle and wildlife. It's an open system, so animals move in and out there. So what we did is modeled the transition from the sort of paddock-based system that Duncan mentioned to this adaptive grazing system, which you know about, in terms of crawling and herding, et cetera, and what that would do for soil carbon sequestration. So the lessons out of those 2 examples are that in each specific ecosystem, when we are developing a carbon project, and this is where the partnership with FIFA, so Rewild Capital has partnered with FIFA as well, to use the available science of rangelands to design the best possible project in each specific ecosystem, each specific enterprise that optimizes those three returns: carbon, biodiversity, and of course, community benefits. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think I'll ask Max to expand on the work at Shangan. So I think you mentioned that the cattle, the wildlife, and the people, they are living in the same space, without fences, around them, and that's quite an interesting model. I just want to pose a question to you to say, where do you see the future of this interaction of human, wildlife, and cattle space?
I think it's the future's bright for it. I think it's the model that we need to adopt more, not just within our own ranch, but it's something we need to take out to the greater community, not just talking about ranchers, talking about smallholder farmers, communal farmers. I think it's about understanding the whole wildlife economy, that money can be made from wildlife as long as it's done responsibly. One of the things people often talk about is it's been drummed into communal farmers' heads that if you kill an impala, you're a poacher. So the minute somebody goes and tries to go in and talk to them about wildlife economies, they sort of take aback initially, because they're saying, hold on a second, all our life we've been told that's poaching. What are you trying to tell us now? So it's about getting that harmony, getting the villagers to manage what they have, getting us, the commercial farmers, to manage what we have, but in a way that we can create an economy that is self-sustaining, and also give us the ability to export product. For example, the thing I always laugh at is South African farmers or Zimbabwean farmers breeding Wagyu. What's your competitive advantage? Why should I export Angus beef to the UK? It's a bit silly. We've got Nguni, we've got Mishana, we've got Tuli, we've got Ankoli. Let's use our own indigenous breeds that have been adapted to the landscape. And then we've got an export market where we can sell something which they don't have. So I think it's got a great deal of scope. As I say, and always say to Duncan, we'll make the mistakes, perfect the system, and then give it to the world.
Peter, can I just jump in there?
Sure, you can jump in, yeah.
Just to, on that specific point, I really think that this Shangani model, the mixed wildlife and cattle system, is a model that can be replicated across Africa, precisely because it is a carbon project that doesn't displace people like many other carbon projects. It works within the existing socioeconomic system to improve it, whilst you're also restoring the ecosystem and earning the carbon revenue. So you're still maintaining a food system, you're still improving productivity, you can use the carbon revenue to grant or to give market access for sort of regeneratively labeled products, and also it promotes wildlife tolerance from communities, because if you get the accreditation for the biodiversity standard, then you can sell those credits at a higher price. So really this is a great model that we can use, and one that is underutilized, I think.
That's great. Yeah, I think I'll just maybe ask Duncan to expand on his work on wildlife economies with the African Wildlife Economy Institute. Duncan, how can wildlife economies extend Africa's biodiversity conservation and help to curb climate change?
Peter, as Matt said, I think wildlife needs to pay for itself, and I mean it must never get to the point that it's people or the environment. It's got to be people and the environment. And I think development of inclusive wildlife economies across Africa is really exciting and needs to be done. What's really exciting about Rewild, and as Matt's touched on, he is working, and Rewild team are working with communities that are looking at communities rewilding degraded areas in some cases, then claiming those credits, brokering those credits, and plowing that money back into those communities, so enriching those communities. I think we need to think out of the box, and I think we really need, I know that a lot of people are against hunting and sustainable use, but I do think that there is a place for sensible and controlled sustainable utilization of wildlife. Because if it's not going to pay for itself, we are going to lose it. Because if you have to choose between people and the environment, people will always win. I think just to touch on cattle and wildlife, I mean, I really think, certainly for Africa, it's a must. You know, cattle are integral parts of people's lives across the continent. And another program which we're funding through the Jennifer Ward Oppenheimer Research Grant, which looks at funding young emerging scientists on the continent, and that is looking at cattle corridors and biodiversity, and actually that cattle corridors are actually corridors for genetic transfer, and actually are important from a biodiversity point of view. So yeah, I think there's a lot of exciting research to be done, a lot of exciting research happening on the conference and continent, and of course one thing one's got to do is pull it together so it's accessible and then people on the ground can utilize it.
Thank you very much. Matthew, I think you mentioned that, you know, rangeland soil carbon is Africa's #1 advantage when it comes to, you know, to the carbon market. Maybe can you shed light on why Africa is not producing these credits maybe at a scale that it should be?
Yeah, thanks. That's that's something that we're trying to solve. But I think that there's many aspects to that. It is technically harder to implement a removals project for soil carbon because you have to measure it a lot more accurately. You have to plan the intervention a lot more soundly, et cetera, and then with that comes higher initial capital costs to actually implement the project. So you need money to do the feasibility, you need money to implement the training, you need money to set up the infrastructure potentially. So there are a lot higher costs than some of the avoided emissions projects, which are not necessarily reflected in the price that you would get for those carbon credits. And that leads me on to the second problem, is that we need to sort of educate investors and buyers about why these are high integrity credits that hit all of those spheres. I think then, and we had a discussion earlier in the day about some of this, I think then you will see investors more willing to front up capital and take the risk on project implementation and get their returns later on, rather than just buying the credits when they go to market. So yeah, so those are the two main problems that we see, and hopefully we can get around those through good marketing. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Maybe coming to Max, I think Duncan touched on some of the things here. The work that you're doing at Shangani, the holistic management, the integration of wildlife and cattle, how does it benefit the community around you and also the society in general?
It helps because it gives them multiple sources of income. So you can make income from your cattle, you can also make income from your wildlife. But I think it also helps with management. If you can live in harmony with the wildlife and the cattle, you're not stressing so much. You're not, you see an elephant, the first thing you want to do is start throwing stones at it, throwing sticks at it, getting people to come across and calling it problem animal control when it's not really done anything. It's an understanding that, may sound odd, but our ancestors lived with these animals thousands of years ago. We just got westernized and decided we wanted to drive cars. But if you think about it, we need to go backwards, what used to happen. And I think the richness of this model is something which perhaps maybe, but I don't think can be replicated outside of Southern Africa, really. And it's something which we have, where we have a head start on, we have an advantage of within Southern Africa. And, with the carbon credits that Matt's talking about, if that money can go back into infrastructure development and community development, suddenly you're starting to build resilience amongst the people. And then we don't have to be so controversial again, donor dependent.
That's great. Thank you so much. I've got a couple of questions that I'll ask you, but I'll just open to the floor. If you've got any question, Please just ask your question, then this gentleman will answer your questions, then we'll continue.
Hi, my name is Unontle Mngadi. I'm interested around the coexistence of wildlife and cattle. I want to also just have a clearance when you say wildlife, are they particular animals that you're referring to or the holistic of them? And then if the holistic of them, are you experiencing any conflict? Also, the disease transfer, any of those issues? Because in KZN right now, you'll find that protected areas in particular, they're adjacent to communities who own livestock. And one of the biggest issues that protected areas have is that engagement, and it's posed as a threat to protected areas. And you speaking so positively about it, that brings such an interesting understanding of what is really going on.
Well, as I said, we're doing the test work, which we hope will produce the results for everyone to follow. But what's interesting about it is that picture is not photoshopped. That's real. We see that all the time. There's a video I've got, which I can show anybody afterwards, of the cattle at a watering tank and the elephants just coming, waiting their turn, the cattle moving off and the elephants coming in. We have predatory animals, we have hyenas, we have leopards, we have wildebeest, we have kudu, duiker, eland, impalas. So there's a vast array of animals, lots of vultures, and we haven't yet come across any zoonotic disease transfer. And I think that's because we don't have, and I think the big guy is the buffalo, because the buffalo is foot and mouth, it's full of it, riddled with it. But we don't have any buffalo on the ranch, and I think if any were to approach, we would approach parks to deal with them accordingly, because it is a national problem when FMD spreads throughout your cattle population. So yeah, we haven't had any problems with zoonotic disease transfer.
Just to add to Max's point, and that we have had issues with leopard, and because the cattle are now herded, the predation has decreased dramatically because there's always people with the animals, except when they were in paddocks, you were left alone and calves were taken more readily. But it seems to be a win-win, and we've been practicing holistic management for, or should I say the Debsha and Shangani model, for over 10 years, and it's certainly only improved with time.
Can I add on to that? And I think, when you talk about what is wildlife, that's always a controversial definition. But when we talk about rewilding, trophic complexity, it's mainly adding those browsing and grazing guilds. So the science is quite clear that when you add mesoherbivores to a grazing system or arrangement, your soil carbon goes up a little bit. But when you add megaherbivores, it goes up a lot more. So you can sort of think of it in terms of those two guilds at least. And then there's also ongoing research about the role of apex predators directly in soil carbon sequestration through their ecological functions. But I think, having those two classes and then the opportunity for communal rangelands in South Africa, or indeed anywhere else, is to use a combination of the sort of rewilding paradigms, the sort of crawling and herding type methodologies that not only create biodiversity in the rangelands by allowing the plant communities to recover and allowing diversity in the landscape, but then also avoiding conflict with the wildlife and allowing the wildlife to export and import nutrients into that system, which will also sequester carbon. So it can be quite a nice virtuous cycle of interventions that build on each other, if that makes sense. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Yes, can I ask a question?
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Todd Crane from the International Livestock Research Institute in Kenya. I have two questions with very different entry points. I'm not a rangeland ecologist, but from what I understand from my colleagues, you mentioned a lot about basing this on the best science, but I want to query what the depth of the science is on sequestration, especially subsurface sequestration, because as I understand it, the empirics and the models are still a work in progress. So that's the environmental science end of the side. On the other hand, I'd like to query something about governance structures. There are similar initiatives happening in Kenya. I suspect you're familiar. Benefit sharing in communal rangelands as opposed to a ranching situation, I suspect, is very different. And so how do you address the governance of not just movement of livestock, but the distribution of benefits from the carbon market itself such that there's really a concrete benefit and buy-in?
So I think those are great questions. I just want quickly the first one, Matt, and you can talk to the modeling. Vegetation and soils obviously are the key basis. And right from the start, we've done, I think we've got 48 different sites. We're actually monitoring soil and vegetation response over long periods of time. It hasn't always been clear cut. And then, we've crawled animals, which we thought, and where we saw places where the grass, panicum, which are hugely palatable grass, this high, in certain areas where they practice this methodology. But because we've got game and high numbers of game, we find that game are actually hammering those nutrient hotspots and creating bare patches. So we've had to adapt it and make them bigger and smaller to try and address those. We didn't want to turn the whole property into denuded bare patch. But we are seeing huge improvements in vegetation diversity and palatability of grass species over time. Again, time is what's needed, and even 10 years is quite short, 20, 30 years possibly. But on the ground, we are seeing improvements in terms of soil and palatability of grass species. Matt, you've done quite a lot of modeling of the area.
Yeah, I think to answer that is just to to agree with you straight up that we need this. The science of this, I suppose, is in many ways still in its infancy. And as Duncan mentioned, what we really need is time series data of these interventions. But there is enough, I would say, what you would call, I suppose, horizontal comparison data to get a sense that these things work. So on the grazing management side of things, the literature is fairly well established that at the basic level, there quibbles about the exact form of rotational grazing systems, but at that basic level of step change from continuous to rotational, that's been fairly well established and it's quite robust that works. On the wildlife side of it, there's been 2 or 3 big studies that have shown the same results. Again, not across time, but across space, that adding wildlife to these systems does increase or is correlated with higher soil carbon stocks. And there's also loads of literature out there on how adding wildlife to the system can improve grass productivity, which de facto you would assume also improves soil carbon. But what we need to do, especially with these, is collate all of that data, and also with these projects, be very transparent about when you measure sequestration in each auditing period, is it actually working? Anecdotally, I've heard from other developers that it really does work and that we've seen that, but these data need to be transparent and they need to be available somewhere so that we can build the science base behind that. And on your second question, just while I'm on it, that is, I think, one of the key, not just for the projects that we're talking about, but for the VCM in general, is the beneficiation. And I think a lot more work needs to go into benchmarking best practice for governance structures. Of course, it's never going to be a one-size-fits-all, but really having that governance structure robust up front. For example, in Shangani, there's a lot of cooperation with the RDCs, the rural district councils, so that's and the grazing associations, et cetera, really mapping all of that out first. And then this is one area where I think tech can really play a role. Once you've done all the hard work, that is one area where, because everyone is very quick to want to do blockchain stuff and, put this all on these complicated ledgers. But for the benefit sharing part of it, at least, that is where we can employ those technologies, I think, really, really well. So that is one potential solution to redress the problems that have plagued some of these projects. Thanks.
If I could just add in on the second part about the people. I think the first thing is to understand the hierarchical nature of society. So whether it be at government level, village level, corporate level. And I think what's happened in the past is we've adopted a one-size-fits-all. And we've gone in there saying, okay, this is how it's going to be. Government agrees, private sector agrees, but the smallholder farmer doesn't agree, because suddenly we've come up with, and I'm again controversial, a gender balance or a youth system, which perhaps some of the culture hasn't quite gotten to. So it's a question of sitting down with them and explaining exactly what you're doing beforehand instead of just foisting things on them. Because when you foist things onto people, that's where the trouble starts. But if there's a rigorous planning process, then you get the buy-in, then you can look at gender, then you can look at the youth. The biggest problems I find at the moment is, especially as I see it coming from the donor community, and I'm not meaning to disparage them, is they put things onto people. Programs are written in Ethiopia for Zimbabwe. They're written in Brussels for Kenya. And that's how we'll get to a situation where socially it'll never work. I hope that answers it.
Well, thank you.
Matt,
We can hear you.
a question for you. In the previous session, we were hearing about the difficulties engaging with communities around questions of the just energy transition, where, you know, at the one hand, you're introducing climate change at a really high level, and then suddenly there's just energy transition, and then you're sitting with the situation on the ground, which is jobs and food security. So how do you engage with communities around the question of carbon credits? I mean, how do you bring carbon credits and blockchains into village life in Zimbabwe?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I think, going off the back of what Max said, when you're trying to when you've got a sort of preconceived notion of what this project should be and the benefits, and you're saying, okay, this is it, here we go, cut paste from something, and here we go. That's not going to work. But I think the benefits of particularly the soil carbon market, as I said, is that it interfaces and is compatible with the existing socioeconomic system, with the means of livelihood, et cetera, and you are engaging with the communities to not say, okay, you're stopping livestock or you need to vacate your land to plant trees. You're saying, okay, you're doing this, you're earning livelihoods. If we were to do it in this way, you could continue to do this thing that you are already doing, which you already want to do, but you could also earn these credits, and it might also unlock new enterprise opportunities, such as in the wildlife economy. So instead of what I'm trying to say, instead of wholesale changes and saying, okay, instead of these revenue streams, you're now earning these revenue streams, you're building on that socioeconomic foundation, and you're enabling those communities to evolve their enterprises rather than just stopping them and getting off, kind of thing. So I think that's the advantage that we have in these rangeland systems, is that there is a lot of scope to evolve, or at least to transition into sustainable land management from a solid base instead of just ceasing activities. So I think, and also on a technical level, I suppose you could say, I think, and going back to your question, I think a lot of the big projects have failed, and you guys will also have something to say about this, because it's tried to be too much all at once. So for example, one of the only soil carbon projects that has actually sold credits on the continent is the Northern Rangelands Trust, but they implemented over 1 million hectares like that, and it led to huge problems of auditability. There was a report about it, et cetera, et cetera. I think what we should be doing rather is look to grouped project structures where you identify, you cascade out the intervention, you find a pilot first, which is never going to make the project viable, but just to prove the concept, and then you roll it out sequentially like that. I think that's a better structure. It will require longer term investment, which goes back to one of my earlier points about getting investors on board from the get-go, so that you don't have implementation delays, you don't have cash flow delays, but in the long run, it's going to pay off. And I think that is one of the solutions that we can use.
Anyone with a question from the floor? You want to ask? Okay.
We've got one question online. So they are asking, what's the panel thoughts around businesses that are seeking to set up coal mines just a few kilometers away from the Kruger National Park in South Africa in relation to the discussion around wildlife conservation?
I think it's a good question. Initially I feel, ooh, but again, the just energy transition meetings we had this morning, I think there's so many fantastic opportunities that are coming on board, and I think South Africa can lead the way in renewables. So, my view is instead of destroying the little bit of, wild area we have left, let's look at alternative ways of generating clean, green energy. I mean, certainly hydrogen is certainly an option. I think the Kruger Park, again, is a national asset, and I think it brings in a huge amount of money, not only for protection of wildlife, but also for South Africa as fiscus. So it's important to treasure that conservation area. Again, I'm not totally against coal. I mean, the minister has said, when she was walking around Witbank, 9 out of 10 shirts hanging on the washing lines were either from Eskom or mining companies. So we need to replace jobs with jobs. So I think it is important that that's taken on board.
Can I? Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And just building off what Duncan has said, this is where the intersection between the carbon market and emerging sectors, I would say, like the wildlife economy, can really play a role. And when something like a coal mine is proposed for an area, as Duncan said, the permanency of jobs and the value that's created in that area compared to the long-term opportunities of something like sustainable agriculture or wildlife economy, the diversified revenue streams, the long-term nature of those jobs versus the relatively short-term nature of a coal mine should be taken into account. So I think that, again, is where we see carbon finance potentially playing a role to catalyze longer-lasting sustainable enterprises that will yield benefits far into the future than potentially a coal mine might. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone who has got a burning question? Yes.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody. So the question is for the panel, but maybe more for Matt, because you mentioned something about this model being potentially being a premium, providing premium credits. And I just wondered about, so if you think about fair trade, is a model that also bundling the production of, let's say, coffee or chocolates with some other social benefits attached to it that then raises the premium. So I wonder what lessons can be taken also from some of the existing models that have successfully managed to bundle this thing. And one other example that I know about is the specifically around restoration is the 4 returns model. I think it's driven by Common Land. And there they're looking at both financial returns, natural capital returns, and what they call returns of social capital and returns of, I think, inspiration even. So I was just wondering about what other examples are out there that might actually inspire this bundling of just beyond almost a carbon plus credits, so to speak.
Yeah, thanks, Odi. So I'll sort of answer that in 2 ways. The first is that there sort of are existing accreditation mechanisms to enhance the premium of a carbon credit. So, for example, Vera has what they call the Climate Community and Biodiversity Accreditation. But the issue with that in our space for this kind of stuff that we're talking about is that the investors and the buyers don't necessarily know, if it's not trees, they really don't really seem to be interested in those types of projects. So it's about the education of, these are as good, if not better, than those types of projects. And then the second part of that is that that still has a problem, and many people have discussed this, in that you are sort of separating carbon from biodiversity. So you're saying the carbon project is the main thing, and biodiversity is sort of a side thought. And there's been lots of talk about, and now, of course, we've seen the emergence of a biodiversity credit market, which in my opinion is sort of in some ways widening that fault line because you got two separate asset classes where in reality they converge. So I think we should move towards the type of credit that actively integrates biodiversity into the sequestration itself. So you're not just saying, okay, well, we've got a carbon project and we're going to tolerate biodiversity, or we do a bit of biodiversity. The biodiversity conservation itself improves the potential for carbon sequestration. And I think that sort of concept where biodiversity and the climate crisis are at the nexus, it's the same solution, that should be rewarded in the market more than what it is, because it's sort of like a win-win solution. And at the moment, we've got a situation where you sort of got to, do all these different accreditations and then try pitch it and then try explain it, et cetera, et cetera. But if we had a mechanism, and maybe the examples that you pointed out might be one way of doing that, you can show that it's the same sort of process to generate those, and then there should be a premium. Does that answer? Okay, thanks.
Sure. Thank you very much. Okay, let's have one more, and then we'll close the session. Okay, no, that's fine. At this point in time, I'll just give each of the gentlemen 1.5 minutes, 1 minute to 1.5 minutes to just give us a take-home message. Matthew?
Thanks. I think the carbon market has had its ups and downs. There is valid critique that we are sort of using the master's tools to try and solve the climate crisis, but it essentially amounts to greenwashing, and we should be focusing on emissions reductions. All of that is true, but at the same time, Africa is hard-pressed for finance to do the restoration work, to support livelihoods, to improve the environments in which we live. So here is a key opportunity with all the renewed focus on offsets, nature-based solutions, et cetera, to do it better, essentially. Do it better and change it from within. Let us not be beholden to global north perceptions of how Africa can be a carbon sink. Let us actively use this carbon finance to set our own agendas, to invest in our own enterprises, and really take the sustainable development agenda to the next level. We should use the space to add our voice and to really make sure that we are leading the way on what the world could look like in a rewilded planet.
Thank you. Max, your parting words?
The solutions are there. We have them in the South, and I think it's time we brought them to the fore. We need to start plotting our own path. We can't not sit at the table, for example, when we have 20% of the world's cattle. We have systems that we can introduce that will not only help the environment, but will also help our people. And I think it's about time we started shouting about what we're doing. The world needs to know that we have answers too. We're not just here to listen to the global north, as they like to call them, telling us what to do, and we are saying, okay, we'll do it. I think it's time to stand up.
Thank you. Duncan, your parting words?
Great. Science for impact. I think there's only so much money available out there, and I think research and science needs to be, the research that is supported needs to be the right research. It needs to be clear and impactful, and it would at least show pathways to impact. I think way too often good money is spent on programs that actually don't move the dial and lead one anyway further down the line. So research that's going to make a matter, and research that where funding is put needs to move the dial. Thanks.
Thank you, gentlemen, for attending this panel and sharing your thoughts. We really appreciate it. And to all of you who attended this session, thank you very much. Those who are online, who are watching us online, thank you so much. You can follow us online. You can also ask questions online at Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation. Thank you.